Okay, our next step is to start working on the neck. What we're definitely shooting for here is a nice, straight, flat fingerboard. We have a little bit of a rock in it right now, but nothing that drastic and nothing we can't take out as we proceed to radius the neck. Again, we talked about this block earlier. It's a radius block, has a 20-inch radius. Okay. We are going to work the fingerboard. I want to show you how this relates to the body. What we're shooting for here is when the neck is sitting on the body, and we put a straight edge on that fingerboard that roughly where the bridge is going to sit, that straight edge hits the very top of the fingerboard, or top of the bridge. And as you can see right now, this neck is sitting on there perfectly. So really the only thing that we have to do with this particular fingerboard is to go ahead and just simply radius. Now let's talk a little bit about how we're going to do this. Again, I don't have it sitting on the headstock and pushing real hard because again you're stressing that headstock joint. So we have a little cradle that it sits in, and you'll notice off the end you're unsupported here, so we don't want to do a whole lot of work at this point down that end. What actually works pretty nicely, I've cut a small block that has a little bit of a cutaway that matches that same neck tang on the back side of the neck. So if I set this in here and then set this nice and flat on the end of my bench, then at that point I can finish the radius right on the flat top of the bench. Now the key to this sanding is to remain straight. If you're doing this type of action, you're losing the radius. A lot of times what we like to do to start is to take a rasp and just file the neck flush to the fingerboard. And the reason we do that is so that if your fingers extend just a little bit onto the side of the neck, any glue that's on there won't wreck the tips of your fingertips. So if it's just sitting on the edge, you can now ride right along that fingerboard and track nice and straight on that fingerboard. Now just take your time, because initially the scratch pattern that you're going to have on the fingerboard is just going to be on the two sides where the radius hits first. If you put a chalk line down the very center, when you continue to pass this, again, you'll notice that the two chalk lines came off first, and once that center chalk line disappears, you know you have the full radius down the whole length of the neck. Okay, so we're going to proceed with that. I'm going to do pretty much from the 12th fret where I'm sitting right now through the end of the 1st fret, and then we'll shift back to this block to do roughly from the end of the fingerboard through about the 8th or 10th fret, and then we'll start to look back at our straight edge to make sure that we're staying nice and flat. If we got a little bit of a crown, we can work that center section a little more to get the crown out to get flat. But I think this one will dress up pretty nicely. So we'll just keep sanding, working on the crown. Okay, at this point our fingerboard is completely radiused. We've checked for flat. Now at this point we've sanded through both 80 and 120 on that fingerboard, both using the radius block. So at this point we're ready to go ahead and glue the inlays, and you'll notice I've done a couple of things. One is take something that has a hook type blade and run it through each one of the fret slots. I want to make sure they're nice and clean, that there's no dust in there, nothing's gotten in there. Now if that hook blade is not something you have, but you have the Japanese saw, you can place that in there, just run it through one time and just blow it out. You'll notice that I also have blue tape that I've put over those frets that are next to areas that will either have a dot or the 12th fret inlay. And I do that for just a simple reason, that when I go to use the glue, we use a really watery glue, and if that CA gets down inside that fret slot, it's really hard to get it out, and it's certainly going to prevent a fret from seating fully onto the fingerboard. Now the other thing too that you may encounter is that the inlay slot may be too low. If it's too low, then some of the dust that you've taken off from the fingerboard can be put inside that area and compacted with the actual inlay until you bring it up to the height. Now if it sticks out too far, then you've got a little bit of chisel work to make it flush, but you want to try and get this as close to being flush as possible. So at this point I'm ready to go ahead and I'm going to fill this area with CA, and then at this point I'm going to drop that inlay piece in there. I don't want to hold this with my finger because I don't want to glue myself to it, but a little bit of accelerator at this point. You'll see at this point it starts to foam up, so it's actually going through the reaction. Now, the other thing that we have are these tiny little dots, and these can be tricky. I'll tell you, what I found to be the easiest way to do this is get the inlay to lay flat on the fingerboard, and if you take your fret hammer and simply move it around and push it so it kind of half falls in, and then hammer it until it just sits a little above, either flush or a little above the fingerboard. And then at this point I'm going to put a drop right over the actual inlay, and I'll give that a second before I actually hit the accelerator because I want that to seep down